Все-таки вернуться приятно. Здравствуй, старый друг. Давно мы не виделись, очень давно, и я даже задаюсь вопросом, помнишь ли ты меня? Ну, потому что если не помнишь, то, знаешь, не беда. Нам зато представится возможность встретиться в первый раз еще раз. Ну, как часто это бывает. А если помнишь, то уже знаешь, что я за человек и с чем меня едят. И ты также знаешь, что я, в принципе, не прочь познакомиться с тобой в первый раз, еще раз. Сделаем это ремейком нашей первой встречи. Не, это далеко не самое идиотское, что я от меня слышу. Если ты меня помнишь, конечно. А если не помнишь, то не самое идиотское, что ты от меня еще услышишь. И как полноценный ремейк, наша новая первая встреча не должна содержать ни оригинальной сути, ни смысла. Зато должно быть что-то новенькое. Поэтому для обсуждения предлагаю нам с тобой сейчас поговорить о чем-то топиковом. К счастью, у меня в квартире есть окна. Сквозь них я вижу мир, который сейчас происходит. И недавно я узрел возможность для обсуждения кое-чего интересненького. Я говорю о фильме, одним своим названием обеспечив себе огромную кассу. Неудивительно, ведь речь идет о реальном историческом событии, об общеизвестной трагедии, на которую пришли смотреть люди. Я говорю о фильме, известном своими спецэффектами, но неизвестно, какой этот спецэффект хоть что-то ему добавляет. Я говорю о фильме, который, несмотря на связанность с историческими событиями, за основу центральной сюжетной линии берет романс вымышленных же персонажей. Я говорю о фильме, который кощунственно бросил реальных героев, реальные исторические события на задний план, а на передний выставил вымышленных персонажей, вымышленную картонную историю, все ради развлечения зрителя. Я, разумеется, говорю о «Титанике». Ладно, давай обо всем по порядку. Во-первых, известно, как лодку назовешь, так она и поплывет, а потому громкое имя и неплохая рекламная раскрутка, и к первому рейсу на борту уже полно людей. А это добрая половина успеха любого коммерческого продукта. Другая половина — это непосредственно самореализация. На ней держится весь проект, и она оставляет за собой последнее впечатление. И, будем откровенны, люди заплатили за интересный опыт, а значит поездка не должна разочаровать. Корабль начал идти ко дну после столкновения с королем мира. До этого уже уничтожили практически все человечество при помощи восставших машин, а потому знающим толк в убийстве людей при помощи их же изобретений. И вот, когда все проблемы казались решенными, на поверхность всплыл важный вопрос: а о ком, собственно, будет фильм? Очевидным кажется ответ о судьбе пассажиров и экипажа, пока в человеке не проснется жажда большего. Можно сделать обычный фильм, который нормально держится на плаву и достигает своей цели. А можно сделать больше, выше, быстрее всех остальных. Можно рассказать историю об настоящих людях, а можно выдать своих и вставить любовь, погони, злодеи всякие, алмазы, картинки, перестрелки, треугольники, секс, комедии и прочее. При этом оставить реальных исторических личностей на заднем плане, чтобы получить из-за них деньги, чтобы было все. И все этот фильм получил. Ты должен понять, что исторические фильмы, они собирают определенную кассу. Художественные фильмы собирают свою, и до этого эти миры не пересекались, потому что, как бы казалось, как-то неправильным и невозможным их как-то пересечь. Но все же в 97 году это получилось. Вымышленно соединилось с реальным, и Селин Дион спела свою слезливую песенку. Зритель проголосовал долларом, Академия наградила статуэтками, и, казалось, достигнут некий идеал. А проверка времени поставила важный вопрос. А идеал, собственно, чего? Между прочим, в свое время оригинальная трагедия Титаника заставила некоторых людей поверить в высший разум. Они увидели в трагедии некое божественное или что-либо другое воздаяние, наказание даже природы и человеческого высокомерия. Экранизация же Титаника может заставить некоторых людей поверить в дьявола, потому что требуется определенный уровень такого цинизма, чтобы хорошенько, как следует, заработать максимально на мертвых душах, будем откровенны. Ну, это ты преувеличиваешь, я уже слышу. Ведь фильм-то сделан с благой целью — посвятить людей трагедии, так что совсем не все так плохо. Но дьявол, как говорится, в деталях. Все сердобольные помнят сцену о морячке, первым делом принявшем взятку от главного злодея, а затем застрелившим пассажира и самого себя. Морячка звали Уильям Макмастер Мёрдок, и он был реальным морячком на борту корабля. Правда, он был известен в первую очередь как эвакуировавший огромное количество пассажиров и героически потонувший вместе с кораблем, а в фильме его стало быть изобразили вот так. Город Далбити, в котором Уильям вырос, и главный город, который является и по сей день, подал в суд на создателей фильма за образ Мёрдока в нем. Странно, видимо, они не знали, что фильм-то художественный. А создатели фильма потом публично извинялись перед предками Мёрдока. Они, наверное, тоже не знали, что фильм художественный. Племянник Уильяма извинения принял, но отметил, что непоправимый ущерб уже сделан, что о публичных извинениях забудут через пару лет, а фильм, порочащий его предка, останется навеки. О, но зачем слушать эту вымученную лирику от меня, когда можно услышать более складную речь от непосредственно даже исконного американца? Представляю тебе Confused Matthew, интернет-обзорщика, известный своими специфичными взглядами на фильмы, что некоторые считают его недостатком, но я нахожу это его достоинством. Около года назад он сделал полноценное ревью на «Титаник» в 4 частях, но я предоставляю тебе на осмотрение лишь эпилог. И пусть языковой барьер не будет преградой. В свете недавних событий, уверен, ты и многие другие найдут этот фрагмент весьма интересным.
John Simon once said in a negative review of Star Wars, and I know you guys are like, what, Matthew? John Simon? Star Wars? But trust me, I am going somewhere with this. John Simon once said in a negative review of Star Wars this: strip Star Wars of its often striking images and its scientific jargon, and you get a story, characters, and dialogue of overwhelming banality. I thought about that line of criticism a lot when considering this film, because when applying the same test to Titanic, it brings something to light that is far worse and far more amazing to me than what was said of Star Wars. Strip Titanic of the name Titanic. Set this on any other boat in any other place and time in history. Keep the same characters. Keep the same effects. Keep the exact same story. Just don't call this Titanic. And you get exactly what Simon described: a story, characters, and dialogue of overwhelming banality. You also get a movie that no one would ever have bothered to remember. Only because this movie bears the name Titanic did anyone bother with this. And since it's not even about what the title says it's about, it turns a movie that would have simply been a snooze fest into something of a remarkable insult. It uses a real tragedy to get a trite love story out there into the theaters to make money. Titanic is like those little fish that attach themselves to the bigger fish and suck off of them their whole lives. I asked myself before going into this review whether I thought this movie was bad based on the fact that it just repackaged a version of the story done a million times already, or whether I thought it was bad based on the fact that it pees all over a real historical event. And it turns out that the answer is both. Equally. This was a pretty bad movie on its own, but coupled with the fact that it shits all over history, it becomes nearly abominable. Let's start with the historical part, and then go from there. Now, to be fair, James Cameron never pretended that this was going to be a historical look at the Titanic. He did not mislead people. He had planned from the beginning to fictionalize these events. The problem is, that's a bad idea. Who thinks about a tragedy and says, we're going to have it going on passively in the background while I go do my own thing with it for 2 hours? Who wants to take a real moment in history and fictionalize it for no other reason than for the audience's entertainment? Now, I know some of you might be saying, well, okay, but where's the harm, Matthew? People know this wasn't the real story of the Titanic. They know the information is out there about what really happened. They just like this fictionalized version of it. How is it hurting anyone? Well, I'll tell you how it's hurting people. It's hurting people because, for reasons I can't fathom, this movie is so damned huge that it has completely overshadowed the real story in our culture today. And as a result, I'm sorry to put it like this movie makes people stupid. I'm not saying you're stupid if you like this movie, let me repeat that. I'm not saying you're stupid if you like this movie. I'm saying this movie literally breeds nothing but ignorance among people who will never know any better and only know what they see from this movie being constantly played and referenced everywhere. James Cameron's Titanic actually became a bigger and more well-known phenomenon than the real story of the Titanic. That's a problem. What does anyone even think about anymore when they hear the word Titanic? Do they think about the real human tragedy? Do they think about the real human cost? No, they think about that stupid, trite love story. The RMS Titanic, the real ship, not the stupid movie, recently had its 100-year anniversary of its demise, and they tried to commemorate the event on the talk. Now, once again, we're talking about the anniversary of the real ship, with the real people on it. So I'm sure the commemoration will be handled with dignity and respect for those who gave their life. Oh, for fuck's sake! It's a movie! It didn't happen, you fucking loons! It's just a movie! Those were real people who really gave their lives on that ship, and their memory and their legacy deserve a lot better than Celine Dion playing on the talk! You make me sick! When you think of the story of the Titanic, the last thing that should ever go through your mind is romance. But thanks to the baffling success of this movie, that's all anyone associates with it anymore. And that brings us all down at least one collective IQ point in our society. I mean, you could do this with anything. Take the exact plot and set it anywhere in any tragedy. Chernobyl, the Hindenburg, Hiroshima, Pearl Harbor. Oh wait, they actually did that. And why do you think that is? Why do you think they thought they could get away with this? Because James Cameron got away with it. And just imagine if in 100 years from now, they make this exact same movie set in the World Trade Center. Just imagine what a terrible insult that would be. Now, at times in this review, I had compared Titanic, which I hate, to Moulin Rouge, which I love, because both films have the exact same core plot. But people have been asking me for years why I had a problem with Titanic not being about the real Titanic, but I had no problem with Moulin Rouge not being about the real Moulin Rouge. That is a perfectly legitimate question, and I hope my answer will at least make sense to you. After becoming an admirer of the film, I did a little bit of research about the real Moulin Rouge, not extensively to be honest, but here's the thing. While the history of the real Moulin Rouge may be interesting, it's not particularly important. This is important. It's part of who we are. It's part of our collective human condition. It is a real-life parable about the hubris of humanity. Our collective dicks were so much bigger than our brains, we built a huge ship that didn't have enough lifeboats on it. And that only scratches the surface of what the Titanic story really teaches us. It teaches us about bravery, chivalry. It had nothing to do with class struggles and fucking in a car. Another reason Moulin Rouge doesn't bother me in this way is that the setting itself was fictionalized. No one is going to mistake the cartoonish events in that film for the real thing. It also wasn't so huge a phenomenon that it completely overshadows the real one and prevents any other story being told about it. If someone wants to make another movie that tells the story of the real Moulin Rouge, they can easily do so. No one will ever make another Titanic movie. Let me try to cover that base a little bit more, actually. At least not for another 80 years will anyone ever try to make another Titanic movie. What studio would take that risk? What writer would take that risk? It's the biggest movie in the world. No matter how real or how much better another Titanic film could be after this, there's just no topping that. So I think I've covered everything I can about that aspect of the film that bothers me, so let's move to the story itself. In this part, I will be comparing Titanic heavily with Moulin Rouge, but I want to stress from the beginning that I'm not arguing Moulin Rouge good, Titanic bad. I think that's true, but this isn't me pushing a movie I like onto others. Since both films have the exact same core plot, this comparison will help me to clarify why one worked for me and the other didn't. But I'm not an evangelist preaching the gospel of Moulin Rouge here. While I realize that this isn't the only reason people didn't like the film, one of the major issues people seem to have with Moulin Rouge was its frantic pace and jumping all over the place like a kid with too much sugar. The people who complain about that element of the film are not wrong, and I think that is a perfectly legitimate reason not to like the film if this isn't a style you prefer. I've never paid the least bit of attention to style, so it didn't affect me, but if you do, then I can absolutely see why you wouldn't want to watch a film like this. It's just like Blade Runner. As I've said before, Blade Runner is slow and it is boring, and anyone who complains about it so is correct. I simply don't think its pace has any bearing on how good it was. Same with Moulin Rouge. I think in that way, Moulin Rouge is on the clear other end of that spectrum, and those who claim that it's hopped up on sugar and crack in its presentation are quite correct. Again, it simply has no bearing for me on how good it was. But I ask you to ignore that part of the film for the moment and simply focus on how it told its story in comparison to how Titanic told its story. In several reviews, Doug Walker criticized Moulin Rouge for many reasons, one of which was because, as he put it, it's Titanic. And he's right. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? I mean, Titanic wasn't even Titanic. James Cameron literally pitched this idea to studios as Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic. It bothers me when people say that Moulin Rouge is a ripoff of Titanic, not because Moulin Rouge is my favorite movie, but because that statement suggests that Titanic did anything original that anyone else could rip off. This again breeds more ignorance because people seem to be under the ridiculous impression that James Cameron was the first to do this. He wasn't even the best to do this, probably not even fifth best. What is the core plot of this film? You've got the nice girl from one class being forced and or pressured to marry someone she doesn't want to marry, but falls for the nice guy of a different class. This is a plot that has been around since time immemorial. Even Shakespeare wasn't the first to do this. Virtually every modern-day Disney film has this plot. Gloria Stewart, who played the older Rose, was in a movie called Gold Diggers of 1935, which had this plot. La Boheme had more or less this plot. The Wedding Singer had the exact same plot as these two films. It doesn't matter to me in the slightest, however, because to me, it doesn't matter what the plot is, or who did it first, or how many times it's been done. The only thing that matters is what you, the writer, do with this plot. And James Cameron didn't do much. Moulin Rouge was downright celebrating this formula. It knew exactly what it was and played with that knowledge. By presenting the story with three different perspectives, two of which could interact with one another and the third that could not be changed, he conveyed this timeless formula in a new way. Moulin Rouge was almost about this very story, asking what would happen if the participants knew they were in it. It was a fantasy, and at the core it definitely followed the lines and did what it was supposed to do, but the artistry of telling the story is what made it shine. It also helped that Baz Luhrmann had a background in theater, and he brought that to the screen in a big way. Moulin Rouge was basically a Broadway production that Luhrmann just happened to shoot for the screen. This was a screenplay written by someone who clearly understood this stuff. He had experience with the origins of this story and lent his own craft to the retelling. James Cameron didn't really do that here. He just did Romeo and Juliet again. Only he plunked it down on the Titanic. This story just goes through the motions, leading to nothing new or interesting. Without adding a single original concept to this movie, the material almost literally wrote itself. I had said in the review that James Cameron doesn't seem to understand the importance of the Titanic story over and above the fact that it's sunk. He had the same lack of understanding when it comes to this formula as well. Baz Luhrmann is a writer who really understood this stuff and brought that understanding to the retelling of this tale. But James Cameron only seems to know the story on such a basic level. Couple meets, gets torn apart, comes back together, one or both dies, credits. That's all this movie is. Hell, even when Baz Luhrmann did Romeo and Juliet, he gave us a fresh perspective by having one side of the film be classic and the other side be modern. And God, that was a better movie. Which brings me back to my original question. What is so special about Titanic? It all goes in one tidy, straight line that we are all painfully aware of. We've been there before. And James Cameron is only taking us to the same old place. While Baz Luhrmann did something unique with this formula, James Cameron just did it again. And when I think of how monumentally huge this film became, I am honestly and truly confused. Look, I'm not trying to get down on you if you're a fan of Titanic. If you love this movie, great. I just honestly don't understand what the big hulking deal about it is. I mean, maybe if this is the only incarnation of this story you've ever seen in your life, I could understand it. Maybe. Or if you only had Romeo and Juliet to compare. Otherwise, I'm stumped. So let's ask one final question here. Is this a bad movie? Yeah, it kind of is. But this time, it's not because it was written badly. It's because they didn't even try. I would rather have a writer try and fail miserably than have a writer not try at all and succeed the way this movie did. To say that a movie is overrated really doesn't mean much, especially coming from me. It's not a judgment of the film as much as it is a judgment of how the film was received, and every movie that I review as Confused Matthew I think is overrated anyway. But as a parting word, I just have to say it, even knowing the consequences. Titanic is the most overrated movie ever made.
Можно проводить сколько угодно разговор с ветеранами и обсуждениями историчности художественных фильмов, но, по-моему, все эти усилия всегда будут направлены в ненужное русло, пока люди не поймут, насколько глубоко яд вошел в систему. Идеал чего был задан в 1993 году и к чему стремятся отдельные заинтересованные люди. В конце концов, чем они хуже? Вот такие дела, друг мой. Кстати, не знаю, как ты, а я жду не дождусь коммента, который скажет: но ведь название Сталинград, почему-то Титаник. И вообще большая часть американцев слизана. А то, что наши, сделано из рук плохо. Что это вообще такое? Ну, это все уже история.